Tonight at 10, Downing Street admits that staff gathered inside during the first lockdown to wish Boris Johnson a happy birthday. In the cabinet room at number 10, it's claimed up to 30 people were present at a time when indoor gatherings of more than 2 people were banned.
Happy birthday to you.
It all happened just a few hours after this school visit. Mr Johnson's colleagues are playing it all down, while Labour says it's more deceit.
This is yet more evidence that we've got a Prime Minister who believes that the rules that he made don't apply to him.
This is a small group of staff who'd worked closely with the Prime Minister. They brought a birthday cake in from at the end of the day. I don't think that passed the test of being a party.
More claims, more damaging clamour around the behaviour of Boris Johnson and his staff when the whole country was locked down.
Yes, we'll have the latest on a growing list of problems for the embattled Prime Minister. Also tonight, in Ukraine, civil defence forces are in training as fears mount of a military invasion by Russia. From the 11th of February, people travelling to the UK will no longer have to take COVID tests if they're fully vaccinated.
Unvaccinated, 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 unvaccinated and unvaccinated.
We return to one of London's biggest hospitals to see how staff and patients are coping nearly 2 years on. And worldwide tributes to the prominent fashion designer Thierry Mugler, who's died at the age of 73.
And coming up in the sport on the BBC News Channel, it's Arrivederci Claudio as Watford sack Ranieri after just 14 games and less than 4 months in charge.
Good evening. Downing Street has admitted that staff gathered inside number 10 during the first lockdown in June of 2020 to wish Boris Johnson a happy birthday. The rules at the time banned most indoor gatherings of more than 2 people. The Prime Minister's office questioned a report by ITV News that up to 30 people were present, but said that staff had gathered briefly and that Mr Johnson was there for less than 10 minutes. It's the latest difficulty for the Prime Minister, whose problems have been piling up. He's already waiting for an official report by Sue Gray, a senior civil servant, into several parties at Downing Street. He's ordered another inquiry into claims by the Conservative MP Nusrat Ghani that she was sacked as a minister because of her Muslim faith. And today in the House of Lords, a minister resigned saying the government was not serious about the billions of pounds lost in fraud under the COVID business loan scheme. Well, with the latest on the Prime Minister's troubles, let's join our political editor Laura Kuenssberg at Westminster.
Huw, the list of problems for Boris Johnson gets longer and longer. The defences of what happened behind number 10's black door during lockdown get trickier and trickier. And tonight, this latest set of claims about what happened on Boris Johnson's own birthday threatened to give Downing Street many miserable returns. What politicians want to talk about is not always the same as what the public and their fellow politicians want to know.
How many times do you have to jab into the...
Jabs, 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 Boris Johnson's mantra. But this morning, was he sure there'd be no other damaging claims about what went on in number 10 before the official report by Sue Gray?
Can you guarantee that no more embarrassing allegations about alleged breaches of lockdown within Downing Street will come out before that report is published?
What I can guarantee is that this government is focused 100% on dealing with the big problems that we have.
Happy birthday, dear Minister.
There was no guarantee, and there was more to come. Boris Johnson's playground birthday greetings in June 2020 were not the only ones he received.
What a wonderful way to spend my birthday.
A couple of hours later, the Prime Minister was here. A source who was present told us as many as 30 of his staff were drawn together in the cabinet room. His wife Carrie brought a cake with the number 10 flat interior designer briefly in tow. There was picnic, food and chatter for around half an hour. Number 10 doesn't deny the event took place and says a group of staff working in number 10 that day gathered briefly in the cabinet room after a meeting to wish the Prime Minister a happy birthday. He was there for less than 10 minutes. For the man who wants to sit in the Prime Minister's chair, it's more of a reason for him to go.
We've got a Prime Minister who believes that the rules that he made don't apply to him. We can't afford to go on with this chaotic, rudderless government. The Prime Minister is a national distraction. He's got to go.
Number 10's denied there was also a birthday bash in the flat that night, although Mr Johnson did see a small number of his family in the garden. But these new claims come just as the Tory party is trying to make up its mind over whether the Prime Minister should stay or go.
The question he should be asking himself every morning is me staying in office allowing me to run this office in a way which is making the country better, or am I a distraction?
How then do ministers defend what happened? A gathering inside of around 30 people on Boris Johnson's birthday, when at the time any social gatherings inside were strictly banned.
Well, I think some of these allegations have got a little bit out of hand. I mean, what really happened here is a group of staff, small group of staff who've been working closely with the Prime Minister, brought in a birthday cake at the end of the day, and there was 10 minutes there around sharing a piece of cake. I don't think that really constitutes, a party in the way that some of the other more serious allegations that are being investigated maybe do.
Number 10's claim that all guidelines were followed at all times feels a lifetime ago. As the allegations have piled up, so the defence has shifted. And the danger to the Prime Minister moves closer still.
Live to Laura once again. That minister's attempt there, Laura, to play it down in his own way, is that kind of defence going to work for Boris Johnson?
Well, I think you remember the context of all of this. Boris Johnson's allies, who've been working very hard to try to shore up support in the Conservative Party, have already been finding it quite tricky to persuade their colleagues that everything was above board. And over time also we've seen Downing Street's defence to all of this change. It's not so long ago, as we were saying, that they were saying all guidelines were followed. And now tonight, for the first time really, we have Downing Street admitting that there was a gathering of a sort. They say it was brief, but our viewers will remember at the time the rules were clear that gatherings, apart from in very limited circumstances, were not permitted under lockdown at all. And quite aside the claims tonight, things have already been very rocky, they've already been very chaotic, and that is increasing rather than fading. There's been discussion in the Conservative Party over claims of racism at the top, with Nusrat Ghani, the former minister, saying that she was discriminated against in that way. We've had a minister in the House of Lords this afternoon resigning at the dispatch box. He said it was nothing to do with the current state of political woe for the Tory party, but it all adds to this sense of instability and this sense that Downing Street is absolutely not in control of events. Now, there are people who want to say Boris Johnson stay on, absolutely. They are hanging on for Sue Gray's official report into what exactly happened behind closed doors during lockdown. Yet at the same time, the overall mood in the Conservative Party is a very serious discussion over whether Boris Johnson's problems are starting to outweigh the positive that he brings to the job.
Laura, many thanks again. Laura Kuenssberg with the latest thoughts there at Westminster. Let's turn to the day's other main story, the crisis in Ukraine. And Boris Johnson has warned that invading Ukraine would be a disastrous move by Russia, involving, he said, a painful, violent and bloody business. Washington has placed more than 8,000 US-based troops on a heightened state of alert, and NATO is sending more warships and fighter jets to member states in Eastern Europe. Now, tension in the region has been building, with around 100,000 Russian troops massed near Ukraine's borders. President Putin has publicly stated his belief that Russia and Ukraine are one people. He claims that one of his key concerns is the expansion of NATO, that's the military alliance of European states with the US and Canada. Many countries in Eastern Europe became members of NATO after the fall of the Soviet Union. Mr. Putin's demand that Ukraine never be allowed to join NATO has been rejected. From Kiev, our correspondent Gabriel Gatehouse sent this report.
This is a country in limbo, waiting for an invasion that looks more likely with every passing day, but may yet never come. To the east, 100,000 Russian troops are massed, but the Kremlin says talk of an invasion is hysteria. Facing them are Ukrainian soldiers who hear Western leaders sounding the alarm in ever starker tones. And stuck in between, are the people of Kiev, who, frankly, don't know what to believe.
I think something might happen. I think the probability is very high, but God knows. I think even Putin doesn't know yet what kind of decision he's going to take. But the situation is horrible.
At the weekend, Britain warned that Russia was planning a coup to install a little-known former MP as puppet ruler, suggestions that have been widely dismissed, both in Moscow and here in Kiev. The UK began pulling staff out of its embassy today, saying an invasion could come at any time. The Americans are doing the same. A senior Ukrainian politician told the BBC today such actions are not helpful.
If people start panicking, that leaves our country in a very dangerous position, and it will make it easier for Russia to manipulate us.
The reality is, of course, that this country is already at war and has been since 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea and funded and provided weapons and sent in troops to support a separatist rebellion in the east. Around 14,000 Ukrainians have already died in that conflict. These are some of their faces. And so for people here, the question is not, will there be war, but will this war escalate? For months now, the Ukrainians have been preparing a territorial defense force. Volunteers like Marta Yuskiv, a doctor in her 50s, is among those who are training for a possible defense of Kiev.
Of course I'm worried, because I'm a peaceful woman. I don't want to have a war started, but in any case, in case it started, I should be ready to defend the country.
Meanwhile, a kind of normal life continues as the people of this country wait nervously to see what fate and larger geopolitical forces have in store. Gabriel Gatehouse, BBC News, Kiev.
Well, this evening, President Biden led a conference call with European leaders to discuss the crisis in Ukraine. And all day, Western leaders have been warning Russia of the consequences of invading that country. There were statements early this evening from the Pentagon in Washington and from NATO, but we start with the UK.
Invading Ukraine, from a Russian perspective, is going to be a painful, violent and bloody business. And I think it's very important that people in Russia understand that this could be a new Chechnya.
NATO is a defensive alliance which does not threaten Russia or any other country. But we will always do what is necessary to protect and defend all our allies. And I welcome that allies are stepping up.
The United States will act firmly in defense of its national interests in response to actions by Russia that harm us, our allies, our partners.
Well, in a moment, we'll be talking to our Moscow correspondent, Steve Rosenberg, for the latest there. First to Washington, our correspondent, Barbara Platt-Usher. Barbara, acting firmly, said the Pentagon spokesman. Does that mean in economic terms with sanctions, or does it mean in military terms, possibly?
Well, it means both, actually, Huw. They have been saying all along that there would be severe sanctions if the Russians send troops over the border into Ukraine, financial sanctions, export controls on technology that's needed for key industries, that sort of thing, but also militarily. Now, the Americans are not going to be sending troops to Ukraine. They've made that very clear. Actually, Ukraine, of course, is not a NATO ally, so they don't have that obligation. But they are sending weapons and increasing numbers of weapons. What they have announced now is that they are prepared to send troops to Eastern Europe, to NATO allies in Eastern Europe as part of a NATO reaction force if one is called up on the border with Russia, that they are on alert. They have not yet been deployed. And all of this is in the language of unity and resolve. There's been a real push in the last couple of days to again project unity between the United States and Europe and NATO, and that was at least part of the impetus for the call that President Biden held with European leaders here this afternoon. In fact, there's been quite a ramp up of the rhetoric of alarm over the past couple of days, although the security situation itself, while worrying, hasn't really changed that much. So there's been some criticism that the West is contributing to the escalation. But the State Department really rejected that quite strongly when we asked about it today. They said, no, this is all about deterrence and defence.
Barbara, many thanks for the thoughts there in Washington. Let's go to Moscow and talk to Steve Rosenberg. Steve, these statements, this attempted projection of unity, deployment of troops, we've already talked about that in the past few days. What's the reaction there in Russia then?
Well, I mean, the Russians have already criticised what they call Western hysteria over Ukraine, and they will surely apply the same label to any future Western troop deployment. I think the problem for NATO now is it sees a threat, so naturally it wants to boost security for its allies and its partners, and that means deploying more warships and more fighter jets and potentially thousands of troops to Eastern Europe. But the danger of that is that it plays into the Kremlin's narrative that the West threatens Russia's national security, and that sparks more muscle flexing by Moscow and more instability. Having said that, I think the Kremlin could see today that the one thing that muscle flexing and sabre rattling is bad for is the financial markets, because what we saw today, Russian stocks falling sharply, the Russian ruble fell against the dollar and the dollar against and the pound, and that adds to a sense here that many people are concerned about where all of this is leading.
Steve, many thanks again. Steve Rosenberg with the latest thoughts there in Moscow, and Barbara Pletasher in Washington. Now, people arriving in the UK from abroad will no longer have to take COVID tests if they are fully vaccinated. The changes will come in on the 11th of February in time for the half-term break, and rules have also been eased for unvaccinated travellers who will no longer have to take a day 8 test or self-isolate. Our transport correspondent Katie Austin has more details.
Even a day of less than glorious weather couldn't dampen the mood of tourism businesses in this corner of southern Spain today. They hope a further easing of travel restrictions will mean more Brits come over for half-term.
It's going to make such a difference to so many people, to the travellers, to the people with businesses over here, and obviously in other countries as well.
From the 11th of February, fully vaccinated people will no longer have to pay to take a COVID test after arriving in the UK.
Oh yes, fantastic.
To the relief of passengers we spoke to at Gatwick Airport.
I'm just me, but if it was a family, oh my goodness, the expense of it.
It's pointless to have them, frankly, particularly after all the palaver we've been through with the vaccinations and the process.
Those who haven't had both jabs will no longer have to take a COVID test on day 8 after arriving. People planning holidays or other trips will still need to pay attention to the entry requirements and COVID rules in the place they're visiting, but the travel industry sees today's announcement as a significant welcome move. Airlines say it brings international travel back towards near normality for fully vaccinated travellers.
Every time that the government have removed these restrictions on travel as well, that there's been a surge and a boost in the sales, and I don't think that's going to be any different right now.
The government says the vaccine rollout has made these latest changes possible, but one public health expert urged caution.
We are not out of the woods in terms of the numbers of people with COVID. And although this is welcome news for a sector, it shouldn't be seen generally as yet another signal that it's all okay.
Passenger locator forms will still be required. The Omicron variant put yet another dampener on the travel sector's fortunes. Today's news has fuelled hopes its recovery can take off again. Katie Austin, BBC News.
Let's take a look then at the latest pandemic figures in the UK. There were almost 88,500 new infections recorded in the latest 24-hour period. So with just over 93,000 new cases on average per day in the past week. More than 17,500 people are in hospital right now with COVID. Another 56 deaths were reported. That's of people who died within 28 days of a positive test. On average in the past week, there were 263 deaths per day. And on vaccinations, nearly 37 million people have had their booster jab, and that is 64.2% of those aged 12 and over. Well, the Plan B COVID restrictions in England are due to be lifted later this week. The World Health Organization says light is at the end of the tunnel for the UK. But officials here are quite cautious, in part because of the number of unvaccinated people, estimated to be around 5 million. Now, in the first of two special reports, my colleague Clive Myrie, cameraman David McElveen and producer Sam Baranti have returned to the Royal London Hospital to talk to staff and patients there.
At the Royal London Hospital, a multi-bed intensive care unit sits abandoned and silent. The worst has passed in this pandemic, but is it over?
So this ward down here, all the way along there, full of patients this time last year. Correct, one of 8 wards that we ran at the time.
Now there's just one ward with 6 patients.
Those who are vaccinated.
Consultant Nick Bunker, who worked through the darkest times, points out what unites 5 of them.
Unvaccinated, 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 unvaccinated and unvaccinated. Does it make you angry? I think it's mixed emotions. COVID isn't universally the only disease where people make poor decisions. Right. But it's resources that we're using to treat people we don't have to.
So big breath in, tight seal, and cough. Good.
COVID vaccines have now allowed many millions to breathe easy in the pandemic, relieving pressure on the NHS. But Gonan Haimes, a once healthy 58-year-old, chose another path that nearly killed him.
I was close to death.
So why did you not take the vaccine?
Fear of the unknown.
Fear of the unknown. So you were just worried about this thing being put in your arm?
Uncertainty. Better take the vaccine.
Better take the vaccine.
I think so.
Asif Hussain would have had no qualms about getting a jab. Still in his 20s, he's on his feet now, just about. We last saw him in hospital a year ago, infected before the vaccine rollout. We didn't think we'd ever see him again.
What did you think when you saw the video of you intubated, asleep at the Royal London? What was that like when you saw it? What did you think?
It was unbelievable. I had to watch it back a few times just for it to register in my head. No, that's you asleep, that's you limp laying there. So it was shocking, and it did take a while for it to register in my head. You know what, this is what you have been through.
The rest of society is moving on. We've got to live with this thing now. No suggestion that there's going to be another lockdown, potentially.
Yeah.
But is there a sense, because of the long COVID, that you will always be blighted by this thing?
Of course. I haven't been able to go back to work. So I was a gas engineer by trade, so, you know, a very physical job. With my condition at the moment, I don't think I'll be going back to work, that type of physical work, anytime soon, yeah. I remember my wife telling me they called her and they told her and mum to come and say their goodbyes to me. And I can't imagine how difficult it must have been for them, you know. But, you know, it's all thanks to God I've made it through.
The pandemic has forced much self-examination. What are our thresholds for lockdowns and mandates and COVID rules? We all looked within, appraising our own capacity to cope, and the NHS has had to do the same, scanning forensically and examining its practices and procedures. And one of the biggest questions is whether COVID vaccinations should be mandatory for staff. The government says yes.
Actually, yeah, please, so it's fairly urgent.
But consultant Mari Healy,
still coming, go, go, go,
who helped lead NHS troops at the Royal London in the battle against COVID, thinks differently.
I think the difficulty with the mandatory vaccination is we're going to lose staff, and I think we can't afford to.
Do you know staff who've made it clear that they're going to leave?
Yes, definitely. I believe that to be true, and we have already lost some.
It's a bit of a numbers game, isn't it, tonight?
Staffing pressures made worse by the highly infectious Omicron variant.
I'm 6 nurses down. I have no one.
Fears over rising cases after Plan B restrictions are lifted, and longer-term, ever-growing waiting lists all mean tough times ahead.
Ready, break, flip.
So, make no mistake, the worst of the COVID pandemic may be over, with fewer patients needing the most intensive care.
You should feel it coming out, but it won't be painful. Okay? And then after that,
But the pressure is still on the NHS in so many other ways. Today, 48 hours after we first met Gonan, he's having his artificial airway removed. He'd spent over a month on a ventilator.
I can breathe. It's a miracle.
It's a miracle. COVID didn't beat him. Can the NHS say the same?
I'm alive.
Clive Myrie, BBC News.
The WikiLeaks founder, Julian Assange, has won the right to ask the UK Supreme Court to block his extradition to the United States. Now, the ruling is likely to mean months of legal argument, stalling attempts to take him to the US to face charges there over the publication of classified documents. Thierry Mugler, one of the most influential fashion designers of the past half-century, has died at the age of 73. Mugler was best known for his theatrical designs, some of them inspired by the 1940s and 50s, which were worn by stars including David Bowie, Lady Gaga and Beyoncé. Mugler was born in Strasbourg, and by the 1970s he'd opened his first boutique in Paris. Our correspondent Lucy Williamson looks back at his life.
Fashion, Thierry Mugler used to say, isn't enough on its own. It needs music and theatre. His clothes were extravagant, even surreal. His shows, magical worlds, where superstars like James Brown mingled with models on the catwalk.
Anything could be possible with Thierry, really. As a man, he was really gentle, but very perfectionist and always without limit. I mean, he can make us wear things that you can't even imagine, you know? What he loved it is like play with it, enjoy it, just have fun.
At his height in the 1980s and 90s, Mugler influenced a generation, including stars like David Bowie and Diana Ross. His perfume, Angel, became a rival to Chanel No. 5. He's been rediscovered in the past few years by new celebrities like Beyoncé, Lady Gaga and Kim Kardashian. Today, the Museum of Decorative Arts in Paris waived entry fees for its retrospective of Mugler's work. Designs inspired by robots, insects, even motorbikes. Thierry Mugler made his name with fantastical, futuristic designs that exaggerated the form of the human body. His strong shoulders, plunging necklines, helmets and harnesses came to dominate 1980s fashion.
For him, everything, the center, everything was the body. You know, he was gender fluid before gender fluid. He was, as a man and a citizen, very attached to women's rights, gays' rights, queer culture, a very open-minded personality.
Thierry Mugler created clothes that tested the limits of the human body. His vision, many say, will stand the test of time.
Tributes to the fashion designer Thierry Mugler, who's died at the age of 73. And that's it now, BBC One. It's time for the news where you are. Have a good night.